Hey, third period. So these notes are on our lesson on 2.3, which is Greek and Hellenistic states in the classical Mediterranean. So this is our third set of lessons in our classical period unit. So again, this lovely graphic. So we are going to be looking right here where it says the Athens, okay? So, but as you're going to learn with Alexander the Great, you also see this dark color is also a little bit around here. So, a little bit false with this map, but that's the region that we're looking at. And when we look at this timeline below, we're looking right here, this very beginning part, this classic Greece. So this dark blue area. So if you notice, they were contemporaries with the Shin, right? And we're also going to be looking a little bit at Hellenism, and so that also is a little bit of that green. Okay. So our learning objective is that you will be able to summarize the political and cultural impact of Greek city-states and the Hellenistic states. So by the end of this lesson, you should be able to describe Greek philosophical traditions and state building. You should be able to discuss Alexander the Great and Hellenistic empires, examine Greek art and architecture and their spread. And our essential questions are: how did the development of Greek philosophical traditions change and shape the view of the natural and human world? And why and how did Greek traditions influence both European and Asian communities during the classical period? So as we start these notes, I just want to remind you that you will be afterwards writing questions on the left-hand side. So what I want you to do, my apologies for assuming, is after you're done, I want you to review the information on the right, and I want you to create questions that the information on the right would be the answer to. So think of it as like study questions, even though we don't have a test per se, but it'll also possibly help you when you're answering questions on forms and when you are possibly looking at reviewing for the final exam. Okay, so enough about that. So our first chunk is on Greek philosophical traditions and state building. So starting in the 6th century BCE, Greek philosophers explained the natural and human world using reason and observation instead of divine godly explanations. So if you remember, when we learned about ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt and those ancient civilizations, everything was attributed to something from the heavens, right? So there was a god for the Nile River, for instance. So Greek philosophers started to use reason and observing the environment around them to explain things instead of just attributing it to God or the gods not being happy. So I have no idea how to say this person's name, but Thales, I'll try it, used theories and hypotheses to study natural physical phenomena. Aristotle came up with the idea that knowledge must be backed up with evidence. So it's one thing just to say something, but support with evidence, just like we do in this class. And then math was used to decode patterns of nature. This time period, Greek philosophers, they developed geometry, and in medicine, Hippocrates made a medical school and is the founder of modern medicine. So today, doctors take the Hippocratic Oath, named after him. So moral and political philosophers, so that's Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, they tried to explain and improve human social organizations based on reason and observation. So the republican and democratic forms of government that we have in our country today were created by Greek city-states, and this reflects the philosophy through legislative procedures, public debate, and reason as the basis of policy. So if you think about how our government works today, it is based on legislative procedures, right? So Congress passes laws, public debate, so we're definitely debating those issues, and then using reason as the basis for why we make laws at all levels of government. So our next section of our notes is about Alexander the Great and the Hellenistic empires. So Greek city-states were at war, but were later united under the rule of the Macedon king Philip when he conquered Greece in the middle of the 4th century BCE. So before that, Greek city-states, they were not united. They were each their own little kingdom. Alexander the Great, who was King Philip's son, who was also educated by that very brilliant philosopher Aristotle, he took over after Philip's death, and then he expanded Macedonia into this huge Greek empire. So Alexander the Great, he conquered the Persian Empire, which is this area right here, which we would call like Turkey now in the Middle East. He conquered that Persian Empire. He conquered Egypt, so you see it right here. Parts of Central Asia and also South Asia all the way up to the Indus River, which is why he was in India and influenced the government of India. So some achievements in the Greek Empire under Alexander the Great's rule. So Greek culture and Greek institutions spread throughout that region. Greek cities were created. 70 of them are named after Alexander the Great. Centers of Greek learning were made, including the Library of Alexandria. The Greek language became the main language for government and intellectual exchange. So in that entire region, even in what was once called Persia, the Greek language was the basis for running the government and for in these colleges and schools. And then local traditions, both political and cultural, were allowed to remain in this multicultural empire. So people in these areas, like in Turkey and now Iran and Egypt, they were allowed to keep their political traditions and they're allowed to keep their cultural traditions as long as they recognized that they were also now Greek and had to follow some of the Greek Empire rules as well. So allowed to keep their multicultural identity similar to what we do in this country. So the period after Alexander the Great's death, which is at 323 BCE, until the rise of the Roman Empire in 33 BC, so almost 300 years, that period is called the Hellenistic Period. So after Alexander the Great's death, 4 separate kingdoms were created in that former empire, and you can see them in this map. And they continue to promote Greek culture and Greek language. They promoted establishing Greek political structures like democracy, and they supported long-distance trade. So trade ensured greater cross-cultural interaction and spread between the regions. So when they are trading across this expanse, they are not just selling and buying things, but they're also spreading their culture. So for example, sculptures of the Buddha in Central Asia kept the Greek art form, and we'll be looking at that. So here you see this is an Athenian coin that was found in the Far East, and Ashoka from the Mauryan Empire. That empire was definitely influenced when Alexander the Great invaded. So he had those inscriptions in Greek, in the Greek language. Okay, so our last section in this lesson is about Greek art and architecture and how they spread. So Greek philosophical traditions and artistic practices shaped Hellenistic and Roman philosophy. So Hellenistic and Roman scientists such as Archimedes and Galen applied Greek empiricism to make advances in engineering and medicine. And I encourage you to pause the video and look here at Archimedes, who figured out stuff about density. So here's Archimedes' principle, which is related to him being in a bathtub. And then over here, Galen, that Greek physician. So there used to be a drugstore called Galen Drugs. I don't know if that's still true, but he was the founder of pharmacy. So the Hellenistic philosophical movement advanced theories on individual behaviors and the ways to achieve happiness within societies. And there were three main schools of thought. There was cynicism, and they believed that the purpose of life is to live in virtue and agree with nature. So sort of like this image here, like ancient hippies, right? Like one with the world. And then you have Epicureanism. So this here, which we usually associate with food now, but back then this philosophy was that the goal of life is to find happiness, and the way to be happy was to avoid pain and worry. So there's a very, very famous song, "Don't Worry, Be Happy." So that's sort of the way. So avoid pain and worry. And then there's Stoicism. And Stoicism, that philosophy believes that happiness comes from using reason and not being guided by your emotions. So ruling with your brain, not with your emotions. And then you also have a duty to serve your community. That will also be a way to find happiness. Greek art focused on realistic and idealistic representations of the human body. And this was continued by those artists in the Hellenistic period and also Romans. So Greek architecture influenced the design of civic buildings in both Hellenistic period and the Roman Empire. So this right here, this Discobulus, this is a Roman copy of this Greek art form, and you can see how realistic his muscles are. But his face is very ideal. This right here is the Buddha that is influenced by Greek art style. So has the toga with those flowing robes, has the bun on the hat, has a very Greek facial expression. Then here you can see that the Greek temple has a lot of similarities and therefore influenced the Roman temple. So you can see here we have these columns very similar to that of the Roman temple. We have the shape is very similar to that of the Roman temple. In your sources, you will see be analyzing both artwork and also architecture between these two periods, the Greek and the Roman. Don't forget, once you're done copying those notes, I do want you to go back to help process the information, review that, and write down some questions, again, to help you to really think about this topic. I'll see you in class.